May 3, 2007. A child disappears and the world stops. The clock strikes night in Praia da Luz, and the Algarve air rushes coldly through the corridors of the Ocean Club. Footsteps, a door creaks, the wind blows through the half-open window, carrying a silence that weighs more heavily than any scream. Outside, the sea breathes in short waves. Inside, time holds its breath. The yellow lights of the town cut shadows on the ground, as if the street were trying to point away. The camera pans across. The map. Europe, Portugal, the south of the country, the Algarve coast, a point of light on the cliff, Praia da Luz. Zoom. Neighborhoods, routes, 55 meters that seem like an abyss. Headlines flash like lightning. Disappearance in the Algarve. Search during the early hours. Mystery on a family vacation. Urgent letters. Grainy photos. Microphones. Sirens in the distance. The sound of a door slamming meets the sharp click of a switch. The scene flickers to reveal a dimly lit room. Curtains moving, a crib, a bed, an achingly empty space. The camera pans over details like someone groping in the darkness. The fold of a sheet, the plush toy in the corner, the sunken indentation of a pillow. Outside, tourists whisper. Cell phones illuminate tense faces. Flashlights draw cones of light on the cobblestone sidewalk. The map returns to the screen. White lines outline narrow streets. Arrows mark perimeters. Dots multiply like questions. The wind makes the curtain flap again. A sharp blow that divides the night into before and after. The corridor lengthens. The walls compress the passage. Every noise becomes a hypothesis. Every shadow a possibility. The entire Algarve holds its breath before a single open window. Between the sound of the sea and the whisper of patrol radios, a void settles in that the camera cannot fill. It is the night when the vacation routine dissolves into echo, when the map ceases to be a destination and becomes a labyrinth, where memory records, with cruel clarity, the moment when everything changes. If you want to understand how each subsequent minute reshaped this story, subscribe to the channel, like it, and turn on notifications. The sequel is coming soon and is unmissable. Before they were a household name, the McCanns were a British family seeking what so many families seek when packing suitcases, strollers, and sunscreen: respite. Kate and Jerry, professionals with intense routines, learned early on that life with 3 small children happens in short, precise cycles. Simple meals, timed naps, baths that turn into games, stories repeated down to the last syllable. The trip to the Algarve was chosen less for touristic ambitions and more for the promise of predictability. Constant sunshine, a short distance between rooms and leisure activities, and a resort designed for those traveling with children. At the Ocean Club, apartments with kitchens and landscaped patios created a feeling of temporary home. The key word was control. Being able to warm a bottle on time, change clothes without crossing hotel corridors, letting the little ones run around on the grass under the watchful eyes of other parents. They came with a group of friends who also had children close in age, which turns logistics into community. In the morning, a small, cheerful procession formed. Backpacks, floats, buckets, hats. There was always someone to fetch water, someone to watch the trampoline, someone to improvise extra shade with a towel. Conversations ebbed and flowed about school, shifts, sleepless nights. These were adults who knew how to read babies' biological clocks and preschoolers' changing moods. The resort functioned like a compact village where faces repeated themselves, staff recognized nicknames, and the same families occupied the same tables without making appointments. This familiarity, common in vacation resorts, fostered a sense of security and the feeling that everyone was looking out for everyone else. The stated goal of the trip was simple: to rest without disrupting the routine that gives children structure. Therefore, the days were structured in a gentle sequence. Mornings spent outdoors, alternating between the pool and the beach, with snacks ready in labeled containers. Lunch was served early, so as not to interfere with naps. Then silence in airy rooms, curtains drawn and monitors on. In the afternoon, short walks along the bright cobblestone streets, an occasional visit to the playground, a trip to the market to restock fruit and yogurt. The parents valued the short walks for everything. The children expended energy nearby, slept nearby, woke up nearby. Instead of a packed itinerary, they preferred to repeat what worked, because with children, comfort lies in repeats. At the end of the day, the domestic choreography repeated itself with almost musical precision. A warm bath that washed the salt from the hair, soft pajamas, sunscreen against yesterday's sun, A short story read, in the tired, sweet voice of someone who knows that an adult's rest depends on a child's falling asleep. The little ones fell asleep early, lulled by the distant sound of the pool closing and muffled conversations coming from the common area. Then, with the handheld intercom or monitor nearby, the adults would descend to the complex's restaurant for dinner among friends. Simple dishes, discreet glasses, the conversation finally able to stray into grown-up matters without losing sight of the proximity of the rooms. It was a careful balance between autonomy and vigilance, rest and readiness, so typical of group family trips. This was the context. A family that planned every detail to minimize unexpected events, surrounded by friends who shared their duties and responsibilities, within a resort whose short geography also minimized anxieties. Choosing the Algarve wasn't a leap into the unknown, but a commitment to regularity. Stable skies, predictable seas, memorable routes between the bedroom, the pool, and the dinner table. In the McCann's intimate map, each point had a purpose: to nourish, play, rest, socialize, and the sum of these points formed a repeatable, comfortable daily routine, designed above all to fit the entire childhood into simple days. The night of May 3rd begins like so many other holiday nights. Lights dimmed early, routines repeated in an almost ritualistic manner to calm the house. At 8:30 p.m., the children are asleep. The room is dimly lit, curtains, breathing slowly in the Algarve breeze, toys leaned against the wall, a story interrupted by drowsiness. The air smells of salt and sunscreen. The house seems settled in the predictable calm of someone who spent the day between the pool and the sand. Adults close doors, gather towels, and adjust pillows. Everything indicates that rest has arrived. At that moment, the clock marks the beginning of a meticulous sequence that depends on short distances and constant vigilance. The parents head to the complex's restaurant about 55 meters from the apartment. It's a short walk, barely within earshot, along the same old path, stone floor, yellow streetlights, low conversations from other tables. The group's arrangement is simple and methodical. Periodic checks. One adult gets up, crosses the courtyard, checks doors and windows, listens to the silence in the room, and returns. Then another, taking informal turns between bites and memories of the day. The clock sets the pace. At each interval, a quick step, a glance at the crib and beds, and a return with a nod of, okay. Proximity creates a sense of control. 55 meters can be covered in less than a minute. The sound of a chair scraping barely fades before the front door closes again. The night continues in this rhythm of touches and returns, with the temperature dropping and the wind more of a presence than a nuisance. The resort's volume diminishes. The pool has closed. The playground has gone dormant, and the hum of conversation takes on the discreet tone of the end of the day. Between one check-in and the next, the family's intimate map remains stable. Children asleep, doors checked, windows in place. Trust still rests on routine, on the repetition that makes the hours seem predictable. Vacation time slips by in small blocks of minutes, and each block ends with the same verification. The room is silent, the air circulating slowly, the feeling that everything remains as it should be, until, around 10 p.m., the script breaks its own pattern. Upon entering, one notices the window ajar, the curtain pulled by the wind, a cold movement cutting through the gloom. The room, once a framework of calm, now seems reordered by an immediate and piercing emptiness. The bed retains its mark, the crib supports the afternoon's design, but an absence looms in the center of the space, like a hole of light. The heart races. The mind tries to reconstruct the sequence. Lock, window, curtain, silence. One searches for the sound that explains it, the invisible footprint, the reason that restores order to the clock. But there are no clear signs of a break-in. Nothing that, at first glance, suggests violence. Nothing that immediately indicates someone's forced entry. The hallway, which until then had been merely a functional route, takes on the dimension of a tunnel. Every step echoes. Every surface seems to need rechecking. Doorknobs, door frames, cracks, the alignment of things. Nearby, tables continue. Conversations that are still unaware of the change in tone that has just occurred. The wind, flapping the curtain again, installs the idea that the outside has passed through the house. The distance of 55 meters, previously small, now seems like an elastic interval, expanding along with the urgency. Time, which had been measured in checks, collapses into long seconds, where eyes scan corners, hands open internal doors, Voices call out a name that requires an immediate response. The chronological sequence of the night: 8:30 p.m., children asleep, short trips, periodic checks. 10:00 p.m., window ajar, room empty. It's imprinted like a thin line on which every detail takes on weight. The angle of the curtain, the temperature of the air in the room, the condition of the locks, the arrangement of objects, and in the absence of any obvious sign of forced entry, the question shifts. It's not just what happened, but how could it have happened here, like this, at this distance, in this space of minutes, while the clock continues to tick impassively. The same night, the first hours after the discovery are a gearless machine, driven by instinct, fear, and decisions made on bated breath. The police are alerted almost as quickly as the room is searched. Voices rise, hallways fill, doors slam, and the resort, minutes before a drowsy organism, awakens with a start. Staff are alerted, guests appear on the balconies, someone rushes to reception and calls the emergency number. The clock, which had been marking periodic checks, now seems to tick by leaps and bounds. Every minute counts for a world. As the call registers, the surrounding area begins to be scanned. First, the immediate search: courtyards, gardens, narrow passages between blocks, the already closed pool, the silent playground. Makeshift flashlights made with cell phones draw flickering circles on the lawn. Names are repeated in an insistent whisper, as if the softness could avoid awakening fear. Then, the yard chain widens. Resort exits, parking lots, a sequence of short cobblestone streets, corners where the wind gathers leaves in uncertainty. Gates are tested, low walls examined, flower beds searched. People form pairs and trios, agree on signs, share directions. The police arrive in waves. First a car streaking through the dawn with discreet light, then more officers, and with them, protocols that attempt to impose form on the chaos. The scene must be preserved, they say. The room, the windows, the wire blocks the path between the restaurant table and the apartment door. Everything speaks volumes, but the impulse of those searching recognizes no invisible fences. It's visceral to open cabinets, pull back curtains, check storage rooms, go up and down stairs. It's human to retrace the steps dozens of times as if repetition could summon a response. The air becomes electric, a mixture of salt, perfume, and anxiety. The first dilemma arises. Where does the care with the evidence end and the urgency to find it begin? One agent asks that no one touch anything. Another suggests that organized groups walk through defined areas of the condominium. A makeshift map appears on the reception desk, and pens trace quadrants: north, south, near the wall, service entrance. With each negative response, the temptation to look again grows, as if the eyes might have missed the first pass. At the same time, each additional touch threatens to smudge prints, dislodge fibers, and confuse future interpretations of what happened there. The clock doesn't cooperate. The night, which seemed compact, stretches in strips. Some advocate sealing off the apartment completely. Others argue that nothing is worth it more than searching everything again, this time further away, toward the streets that lead to the town center. You knock cautiously on doors. Quick questions, brief descriptions, promises to report anything. Dogs bark, lights flicker on, faces appear in half-open windows. Reception compiles names, phone numbers, and times, while a line remains open with the central office. The agents try to piece together the backbone of time. When she was last seen, who was at the table, who got up first, what exactly was the interval between checks? Reconstructing the chronology is like erecting scaffolding. Any inaccuracy brings down planks. On the other side, family and friends mobilize on equal forces. Some follow the same routes as if reciting a prayer. Others pause for seconds, overcome by the nausea of uncertainty. Someone insists on interrogating the room with an imaginary magnifying glass, as if the answer lies in a detail that refuses to appear. As dawn wears on, the perimeter grows. Cars patrol adjacent streets. Headlights sweep vacant lots. The dilemma gains moral depth. Keeping the scene untouched may increase the chance of understanding what happened. Raping it may be the price for gaining minutes that might save lives. The decision, in practice, becomes an imperfect coexistence. Caution tape trying to contain footsteps while life, in a tense and distressed version, overflows from the corners. From time to time, the resort falls silent again for a few seconds, as if the place itself were listening. Then, a call resumes, A group regroups, another street is traversed, another garden is examined with the patience of a watchmaker. In parallel, the apartment's immediate surroundings are inspected. Drains, electrical boxes, steps, and spaces under stairs. Agents take photographs, mark positions, and record initial impressions without compromising what still needs to be examined. Volunteers receive basic instructions: don't pick up anything, don't move objects, and report any findings, and proceed in tight lines, their eyes scanning the ground as if reading a difficult page. The wind, which insists on sweeping the sidewalks, seems to jumble smells and memories, but it also pushes people forward, because standing still in these moments hurts more than searching. When searches take to the streets in the early morning hours become a survey of footsteps, the abduction hypothesis emerges almost as a reflex. If it's not here, someone took it. It's an idea born of absence and grows in the friction between fear and logic. Agents evaluate doors, windows, escape routes, the room's visibility from the street, the times when the resort's activity slows down and sounds become more discreet. The map of the surrounding area begins to be read as both opportunity and risk. Access through alleys, low walls, service passages, places where a car can wait for only a few minutes. The word abduction isn't a certainty, but it organizes the questions, summons possible profiles of an attacker, and delimits hypotheses of motive. Meanwhile, the passing of time turns every minute into an obstacle. The further away from ground zero, the more difficult it is to trace the trail back. It is on this shaky ground that the press arrives. First as restless curiosity, then as a flood. Reporters appear with microphones and cameras. Producers ask in hushed tones. Photographers feel their way around the limits of what is permitted, and the resort becomes a stage. Premature headlines open up new avenues. Kidnapping, vacation mystery, surveillance breaches. The case, which until then had been a private timeline, becomes public matter, subject to a hunger for updates. Newspapers compete for seconds of news, pushing conjecture to the center of the Yoi conversation. Family profiles begin to circulate. Nothing that couldn't be said about any couple with children. But under the harsh light of the lenses, everything seems more suspicious than domestic. Photographs of smiles become dramatic counterpoints, and excerpts of testimonies taken out of context sound like contradictions. The abduction hypothesis, useful for guiding searches, becomes a visual flag. Animations reconstruct probable routes. Television timelines flash schedules, arrows, windows, a flow that blends information and spectacle. Meanwhile, insinuations about the family find an echo in the headline logic. Why were they at the restaurant? Who checked last? Windows, doors, locks. Soon the same narrative that calls for solidarity also triggers distrust. The audience, summoned to participate, weighs domestic details with the veracity of those judging puzzles. Comments multiply hypotheses. Podcasts invite experts. Forums vent anxiety and fragile certainties. The case ceases to be merely a search and becomes an arena for discourse. The media effect operates through two opposing forces. On the one hand, pressure moves mountains. It keeps the case alive in the news, demands diligence from authorities, increases alerts at airports and borders, encourages the sending of information, makes databases interact, and reminds neighbors of details that, without the spotlight, might otherwise evaporate. Constant attention drains inertia, prevents the matter from being forgotten, mobilizes resources, attracts volunteers, produces collaborative maps, and fuels the sense of urgency that is essential in the first 48 hours. On the other hand, the same intensity creates noise. False leads take shape. Rumors become transitory truths. Time confusion crystallizes. Testimonies contaminate other testimonies, and the fog of versions demands enormous energy from investigators to dispel misunderstandings. The paradox is cruel. Without exposure, investigations die from lack of air. With too much exposure, they suffocate in thin air. The room, which should speak for itself, becomes interpreted by many. The half-open window becomes a moldable metaphor. The distance to the restaurant, a number malleable to the current argument. The family, still in the midst of an intimate earthquake, must learn public grammar. Word choices, gestures, clothing, everything is read. Silence appears as indifference, crying as staging, firmness as coldness, hesitation as guilt. Each interview is a tightrope between explaining the inexplicable and not offering fuel for hasty conclusions. The press, fragmented into dozens of agendas, alternates empathy, competition, and spectacle. The police, in turn, try to protect the investigation from real-time judgment, limiting details that could compromise future confirmations. At the center remains the question that drives the narrative forward. If it was a kidnapping, by where, when, by whom, with what opportunity? And, if not, what explains the unmarked absence? Between the beacon of visibility and the storm of rumor, the case goes through its first twists and turns, with the metallic sound of the clock marking the interval between versions. What is known as a thin body in suits, what is imagined a swarm. And it is in this clash, pressure that helps, noise that hinders, that the controversy takes hold, shaping each day not only the lines of investigation, but the very way the story begins to be told aloud. When September 2007 arrives, the investigation takes an abrupt turn. The parents are formally named arguidos, a Portuguese legal term that doesn't equate to guilt, but grants procedural rights, the presence of a lawyer, the right to remain silent, and at the same time imprints a seal of suspicion difficult to undo in the court of public opinion. The announcement doesn't fall on deaf ears. It falls on a country closely monitoring the case, and an international press hungry for new chapters. Suddenly, the narrative of the search intertwines with the narrative of possible charges. Questions that previously revolved around the how and where now revolve around the who, projecting a police spotlight onto domestic decisions. The restaurant table, the periodic checks, the half-open window, the defendant's status, explained in legal terms as a procedural guarantee, is translated into headlines with inevitable simplifications. Every word spoken by the parents is read at breaking news speed. Every silence, too. Their presence in the statements, the time they spent at the police station, their departure under flashes, all create high-impact images, which will later be featured in editorials, round tables, and documentaries. Internally, the defendant's status opens doors and raises walls. On the one hand, it allows for procedural steps with clear rights, more formal testimony gathering, confrontation of versions, and revisited expert reports. On the other, it tends to channel resources and attention toward a line of hypothesis that, depending on the solidity of the evidence, can either strengthen or divert the overall effort. The expert returns to the room, the clothes, the car, the samples, while the daily schedule is re-examined with a magnifying glass. Schedules, commutes, phone calls, the mechanics of the checks. The investigation, already dealing with media pressure, now has to shield itself against the suggestion of a pre-made script. In parallel, law firms, independent consultants, and spokespersons step in to organize the flow of information, calibrate statements, and explain the differences between a procedural statute and a formal accusation. Even so, technical complexity gives way to quick insights. For the public, being a defendant seems more burdensome than it is. For researchers, it's a tool. For the media, it's headline news. As the months passed, and despite the volume of investigations, the evidentiary body failed to reach the critical mass required for an indictment. In 2008, the public prosecutor's office dismissed the case due to insufficient evidence, formally closing that stage without resolving the issues. Technically, dismissal isn't an acquittal or a definitive conclusion. It's an acknowledgement of insufficient evidence at that point, leaving the door ajar for reopening if new elements emerge. But outside the court records, the gesture has ambivalent effects. For some of the public, it functions as a belated vindication. The symbolic weight of accused dissipates, leaving the narrative of the family who endured suspicion without conviction. For others, it produces frustration and a residual distrust that legal language cannot dispel. If it wasn't proven, why were they accused? If they were accused, why wasn't it proven? It is in this gap that theories, occasional certainties, and collages of fragmented data that fuel podcasts and forums take hold. The public repercussion travels in waves. At first, relief and empathy, with calls for energy to return to the search and not blame. Then the ebb, retroactive analyses of family choices, criticism of police conduct, debates on international cooperation and resort protocols. Victims' organizations and experts in child disappearances seize the visibility to discuss prevention, response times, scene preservation standards, and communication with the press. Editorialists speak of the risk of investigations revolving around magnetizing suspicions. Legal experts explain once again, that archiving is a technical, revocable act that does not seal the truth, but the residual effect on the imagination is stubborn. The word defendant sticks. The lack of evidence seems, for some, less a snapshot of the evidentiary present and more an invitation to continuous doubt. Between the official bulletin and the collective interpretation, a disconnect arises that shapes the tone of future conversations, influences the willingness to pursue new leads, and subtly and persistently conditions the way each subsequent piece of news is received. As the investigation's frontiers expand beyond the Portuguese coast, the compass begins to point insistently toward Germany. In 2020, German prosecutors announced they were working on a priority suspect, Christian B., a man with an extensive criminal record marked by sexual crimes and property offenses, and whose past holds disturbing intersections with the map of Praia da Luz. The shift in focus doesn't arise out of nowhere. It's the accumulation of fragments that, when assembled, draw a silhouette of interest. Travel records, scattered accounts, objects, phone numbers, signs of presence in a geography that, until then, had been narrated almost exclusively in Portuguese. The starting point is the combination of context and trajectory. Christian B. would have lived intermittently in the Algarve, moving between informal jobs, precarious stays, and an erratic routine that kept him close to, and at the same time, on the fringes of, the areas frequented by tourists. This biographical trait alone would not distinguish him from so many other foreigners in the region. What puts him on the radar is the combination of this history and a criminal repertoire that includes sexual violence. The question driving researchers then becomes less who was nearby, and more, who, if nearby, exhibits patterns consistent with the abduction hypothesis. From there, the chronology begins to be reconstructed using cross-reference tools. Among these, cell phone data stands out: calls, connections to antennas in the area, time windows that match movements with the night of the disappearance. This isn't image evidence. It's a technical mosaic that requires careful reading. Coverage maps, cell overlaps, margins of error. Yet, when aligned with testimonies, this data gains relevance. Witnesses recall vehicles, habits, ambiguous bar comments, sightings and disappearances that, viewed in isolation, reveal nothing but, when aligned, sustain investigative interest. An old van described in more than one statement, a recurring route, a nickname, a story told with inappropriate pride. These are thin threads, but woven together, they resist the first tug. International cooperation, in turn, becomes the linchpin of the process, with Germany leading the investigation, Portugal as the original scene of the events, and the United Kingdom as the victim and her family's country of origin. Requests for mutual assistance, European investigation orders, sworn translations, deadlines, and procedures inevitably slow the process down. Each act has procedural implications in 3 jurisdictions. Each document must be created, circulated, and validated without compromising the chain of custody. This is the necessary bureaucracy of complex cases, where haste exacts a high price and excessive zeal exacts an even greater price: time. In this context, the figure of the priority suspect assumes a delicate status. It's not the same as being charged. It's far from being convicted. For the investigation, it represents the current vertex of greatest plausibility, not the end of the road. Christian B.'s criminal past weighs heavily on the scales, but alone cannot balance the evidentiary balance. Technical data helps support the direction of the search, but alone, it's not enough to provide the robust evidence required by a court. Testimony provides color and context, but lacks objective connections. And so, even with the spotlight and expectations, the situation remains, for now, without specific formal charges in the case. A waiting game in which prosecutors speak of strong evidence, investigators advocate discretion, and the public oscillates between the hope of an answer and the skepticism of those who have seen promising hypotheses fade. The focus on Germany, therefore, doesn't conclude the narrative. It shifts its center of gravity. It changes the language of the records, the cadence of the dispatches, the design of the maps, and the type of forensic analysis prioritized, but preserves the essence of the challenge, transforming a constellation of signs, history, presence, telephone conversations, testimonies, into a body of evidence that survives all reasonable doubt. Meanwhile, the clock ticks relentlessly, and each new detail must find its place in a diagram that only makes sense if all the lines intersect at the same point. In 2025, the case returned to the Center of Operations with a European investigation order issued by German prosecutors, an instrument that mandates cooperation between authorities and allows for the execution in Portugal of investigations requested based on the investigation conducted in Germany. The order is not rhetorical. It defines targets, methods, and evidentiary purposes, establishing deadlines, collection protocols, and chains of custody so that any evidence collected on Brazilian soil has procedural validity in the requesting country. The Portuguese police then organize a search operation that combines forensic teams, canine pairs, surveyors, forensic experts, and specialized equipment operators, adjusting the terrain to the precision required by the warrant. The watchword is granularity. Every square meter must be viewed, tracked, measured, photographed, mapped, and, if necessary, excavated. The selected areas are concentrated in 2 clusters: areas near Praia da Luz, where the geography of the disappearance dictates priority, and locations associated with the suspect's previous life, including the perimeter of a former residence and its outbuildings, garages, storage rooms, small vegetable gardens, access trails, slopes, and drainage ditches. These points don't arise randomly. They derive from the intersection of presence records, known habits, and the logic of low-visibility travel. The planning divides the land into grids, with numbered tape and stakes, so that subsequent reading of the findings isn't lost in the natural chaos of weeds, sand, and rocks. Drones conduct low-altitude photogrammetric scans. A ground-based radar scans shallow subsoil for anomalies. Probes collect soil samples. Dogs, specifically designed to detect cadaveric odor, travel fan-shaped lines. Repeating passes when a clue, however faint, warrants a second reading. At the command post, digital maps receive layers of data: trails traveled, points of interest, preliminary findings, all geo-referenced. What is sought pragmatically are items and traces that can build a material bridge between the investigated timeline and the real environment. Textile fragments compatible with the child's clothing, microfibers that can correlate with reference samples, biological elements in a residual state, epithelial cells, traces of blood invisible to the naked eye, keratin material, transport objects, ribbons, ropes, bags, small and easily discarded electronic components, SIM cards, memory cards, device, keys, vehicle parts that can be associated with the suspect's circle, linings, carpets, screws with residue, as well as discrete signs of movement, depressions in the ground, layers of disturbed earth, changes in vegetation. Also sought is negative evidence with technical value, demonstration that a given location, frequently cited in rumors, shows no signs consistent with concealment, which helps narrow the map and reduce noise. The reason is twofold. First, the need to support hypotheses with material. Without a robust body of physical evidence, investigative lines, however credible, founder in court. Second, the precise reconstruction of trajectories and time windows, a SIM card within a radius consistent with antenna recordings, a fiber that connects to clothing, a residue that repeats a chemical profile already detected elsewhere. Each detail allows us to anchor the abstract clue in the concrete trace. To achieve this, meticulous care is taken. Sterilized tweezers, sealed envelopes, labels with the time, coordinates, and operator, photographic duplication of the context, contamination control with blank samples. When something is collected, the point is photographed again on a scale ranging from general to macro. When nothing is found, the nothing is recorded with the same rigor, because delimiting absences also constructs procedural truth. At the end of each day, what returns to the lab is not just a box of evidence, but a layered narrative. Maps, times, temperatures, wind directions, footstep patterns, dog tracks, ground radar readings. The work requires patience and precision, knowing that any credible connection between the locations around Praia da Luz, the suspect's former residence, and the already established chronology depends on a rare fit, the right trace, in the right place, supported by science and procedures that resist all reasonable doubt, while the terrain slowly yields its secrets, or the confirmation that it does not hold them. The European investigation order fulfills its role, imposing method, preserving validity, and transforming expectation into protocol, a necessary step when hope needs to speak the language of evidence. Among the many ripples the case has produced over the years, one has taken on the form of a spectacle. The young Polish woman who claims her own identity as that of the missing girl. The story erupts online like so many others. A profile, comparative photographs, emotional videos, questions that seem like answers that offer themselves as proof. She displays physical features that, through the generous lens of desire, recall details from old photos. She points to moles on her body, diffuse memories, recurring nightmares, gaps in personal documents. She claims to have found similarities in objects, dates, family histories. The plot is the same as so many searches for belonging, but here the word belonging is applied to a global case, and the algorithm does the rest. Interviews, live streams, program invitations follow. Self-proclaimed experts who superimpose images and ensure millimetric alignments of eyes and eyebrows, as if the truth fit on a ruler. The claim to identity, however, doesn't live solely on digital mirrors. It inevitably enters the realm of verifiable facts. The decisive step is DNA. The collection, carried out using simple and traceable protocols, promises a quick outcome to the public's curiosity. The material is then analyzed. Markers are crossed, probabilities are constructed, reports are generated with technical language and unequivocal conclusions. The result? Negative. Statistics rule out the kinship that would support the reappearance narrative. What for science is a final point, a clear and documented no. For the ecosystem of doubt acts as paradoxical fuel. Theories of contamination emerge, suspicions of manipulation, improbable conspiracies that attempt to keep the hypothesis alive because, for a few days, it offered catharsis to those who have been observing the case for years. Yet beyond the noise, institutional reality moves. The young woman is not who she said she was. From that point on, the line between defect in visibility and concrete harm blurs. The insistence on the narrative, even after DNA testing, yields legal ramifications. Messages multiply, attempts at direct contact, appearances at inconvenient times and places, and the exposure of family members and people connected to the case. What could previously be framed as deception or illusion now constitutes persecution. Authorities classify the behavior as stalking, repeated conduct that invades the private sphere, instills fear, disrupts routine, and imposes an unwanted presence. Criminal proceedings, with their necessary slowness, enter the scene to separate freedom of expression from harassment, public curiosity from violation of privacy, legitimate suffering from predatory spectacle. Precautionary measures are considered. Limits on proximity are discussed, content removals are requested, and the legal system begins to record, in the minutes, what ethics already denounced. Someone is crossing lines. Symbolically, the episode shows how false leads aren't just harmless diversions. They're storms of noise that divert resources, erode trust, and disorganize the collective gaze. Every hour spent clarifying the obvious, a negative test, a discarded identity, is one less hour of focus on lines that can in fact produce answers. For the family, the public wound is reopened. Old photos recirculate. Excerpts from interviews from years ago resurface. Expressions are once again scrutinized in slow motion, as if the pain needed to account for itself with each viral cycle. For investigators, the work of containment piles up. Official denials, clarification notes, communication protocols that attempt to close the narrative without amplifying it. For the public, the lesson remains difficult to absorb in an environment addicted to novelty. Hope without criteria is fertile ground for opportunists and arid ground for truth. And then there's the emotional aftermath. The figure of the Polish woman acts as a mirror onto which many project the need for an ending, any ending, for a story that resists closure. The promise of reunion activates a current of instant empathy, but it also freezes critical thinking. The click comes before verification, sharing before context. When scientific proof arrives and disproves the myth, a weariness remains that is not neutral. It weighs on those who search methodically, reinforces the cynicism of those who no longer believe in anything, and above all, robs the case of its most rare asset, disciplined attention. In this vacuum, profiles once again promise revelations, facial comparisons resurface in new guises, and the cycle threatens to begin again. The case continues, but each false certainty leaves a trail of fragments that will inevitably have to be swept away before a truly important step can be taken. When trying to organize the chaos surrounding the disappearance, 3 lines of reasoning emerge, combining plausibility with what is known about the scenario and the time period: opportunistic kidnapping, crime of opportunity gone wrong, and the hypothesis, debated by the media and treated cautiously, of some insider involvement. Opportunistic kidnapping is based on a simple premise. Someone with prior intent or predisposition observes routines, notices surveillance patterns, and identifies a short window in which the distance between the restaurant and the apartment, combined with the silence of the complex at night, creates a rare opportunity. In this scenario, geography plays a role. Access via alleys, low walls, service passages, dark spots between blocks, all creating a favorable environment for quick action. The half-open window and the absence of clear signs of forced entry do not, in themselves, contradict this narrative. An intruder might prefer less obvious entrances, take advantage of poorly closed doors, or even manipulate windows without leaving obvious marks. What gives strength to this theory is the marriage between predictable routine and timing. If an observer mapped checks and returns, he knew that the interval existed and that, with coolness and luck, he could fit in there. The second line, crime of opportunity, robbery gone wrong, sees the night as the unforeseen outcome of a lesser intention. Someone breaks in to steal, wallet, device, purse, finds an environment devoid of adults, comes across sleeping children, and, faced with an unexpected event, awake, noise, fear of being seen, decides on an action not initially planned. This type of scenario usually explains the minimal trace. An intruder seeking to remain unnoticed avoids forcing locks, preferring gaps and points of reduced friction, entering and leaving quickly, and, in the heat of the moment, making chaotic decisions. The argument in favor here is the banal statistics of theft in tourist areas, where the circulation of foreigners, predictable routines, and vacation distractions produce opportunities. The counter-argument lies in logistics. For an improvised theft to turn into a lasting disappearance would still require a viable escape route, some form of transportation, and an uncommon composure under pressure. The theory remains possible, especially if imagined as a cascade of improbable events that, when aligned, become a tragedy. The third hypothesis, frequently raised by commentators and some in the press, and which requires extreme caution, is that of insider involvement, in the broad sense of someone close, by bond or physical proximity, having a direct or indirect role in the events. It usually arises from narrative gaps, remote psychological readings, and apparent inconsistencies in testimonies. It is also the one that fuels the most public debate, because it offers the promise of explanations in the known field, where gestures, silences, and domestic choices are interpreted as signals. But this line of reasoning clashes head-on with ethics and method. Without material evidence, without a technically supported chronology, and without forensic elements to tie it to the scenario, it remains a speculative hypothesis. Prudence recommends remembering that behavior under shock does not follow scripts. Firmness can appear cold, hesitation can sound like guilt, and interviews given under pressure become fragile artifacts for robust conclusions. Still, because it has been debated in the media, the hypothesis needs to be recorded as part of the ecosystem of theories, not as a verdict. What makes sense, therefore, is not to choose a hypothesis, but to assess how each one relates to the few solid facts. The half-open window, the lack of clear signs of forced entry, the short distance and periodic checks, the moments of opportunity. Opportunistic kidnapping explains the calculated use of the interval and the tactical reading of the terrain. The robbery that got out of control explains the low friction and minimal disorder, but requires a rapid chain of decisions. The hypothesis of insider involvement, in turn, depends on a body of evidence that cannot be replaced by perceptions. In investigations like these, the right question is less, which theory pleases, and more, which theory survives the friction with time, science, and the chain of custody. Until new elements tip the scales, the rigor lies in keeping all three on the table, weighing probabilities without turning doubts into certainties and without allowing the hunger for a plot to close the doors to what really matters: the coherence between setting, chronology, and traces. In cases that become daily news stories, The dust of the news often obscures the true nature of the case. Separating myth from fact is essential to avoid turning assumptions into certainties through repetition. The first recurring misunderstanding arises at the window. Broken in versus ajar. Broken in suggests force, visible damage, marks consistent with tools, and structural fractures. Ajar indicates position, not method. It can be the effect of previous handling, a draft, or deliberate opening. Confusing these terms alters the perception of risk and modus operandi. If the public believes in a break-in, they project a violent intrusion. If they understand that a window was ajar, they understand that the hypothesis of low-friction entry through poorly closed doors, windows manipulated without a trace or even prior circulation, remains open. The technical report doesn't gain muscle just because the headline chose a more dramatic verb. The second gray area is the difference between conclusive evidence and indications and lines of investigation. Conclusive evidence is that which, alone or in combination, stands the test of reasonable doubt. DNA with an intact chain of custody, an undisputed electronic record, a physical finding that connects time, place, and agent with forensic reliability. A clue is a fragment, a compatible time, a possible route, a witness statement that points the way, a telephone call that suggests presence. Lines of investigation are tracks built on evidence. They serve to organize investigations, not to establish truths. When reports or commentaries treat evidence as if it were conclusive evidence, they create a dangerous psychological shortcut. The public begins to demand outcomes that the process, honestly, cannot yet deliver. The reverse is also damaging. Dismissing evidence because it proves nothing kills investigations that depend precisely on the careful summation of small pieces. Another aspect of sifting through the noise is distinguishing what is confirmed in the records from what circulates as rumor. Confirmed is what appears in court documents, expert reports, official police or public prosecutor communications, and what can be audited by dates, documents, and signatures. Rumor is what arises from unvetted anonymous sources, third-party interpretations, excerpts of speeches taken out of context, or inferences packaged as exclusive information. Leaked audio without metadata, a revelation on social media without documentary support, a lip reading of a low-quality image. None of these alone gets through the courthouse. The process has its own grammar, chain of custody, adversarial expertise, opportunity for defense, judicial review. What doesn't survive these filters may be interesting for the plot, but it is sterilized by the method. There are also myths that feed on the natural anxiety for answers. One is the fatal contradiction in statements made under shock. People under acute stress miss time, confuse events, and make slips of the tongue. The psychology of testimony records this phenomenon. Therefore, investigators value structural convergences and objective data, records, images, tickets, payments, not perfecting memory. Another myth is the ignored lead that emerges years later, as if the police had deliberately turned a blind eye. Often what appears to be new has been evaluated and discarded based on technical criteria invisible to the public. Time frame incompatibility, lack of material evidence, or testimony contamination. Making this discarding transparent without compromising the investigation is a difficult balance, and the lack of explanation fuels parallel narratives. It's also a myth that if there's no accusation, it's because nothing exists. Between having something and having enough to accuse lies a procedural ocean. International cooperation, translations, deadlines, expert validation, and the risk of nullification. Filings due to insufficient evidence capture a moment. They don't seal the case forever. At the same time, it's a fact that continuous media exposure can both help and hinder. It pressures for resources and testimonies, but it also creates noise, alters memories, and creates truths through timeline consensus. Therefore, the golden rule is methodical humility, accepting that a case with few traces requires patience, rigorous vocabulary, and a distrust of narrative shortcuts. In the end, clearing the noise means returning everything to its place. The window as described, the clues as stepping stones, not as destinations, the facts as verifiable pieces, the rumors as what they are, noise. This discipline doesn't solve the puzzle in itself, but it prevents the legitimate desire to close the story from erasing the very thing that might one day truly close it. The coherence between setting, chronology, and material evidence. From the outset, The case found a platform in the media and public opinion that shaped not only how the facts were known, but also what became relevant to know. Serial documentaries, with dramatized reconstructions, animated timelines, and expert interviews, promised to organize the chaos, selecting angles, cuts, and rhythms that inevitably created a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end-of-episode cliffhangers. Live coverage, last-minute entries, and Sunday specials reinforced the sense of constant urgency. Each week, a new detail seemed to reposition pieces, even when it involved repackaging old information with more persuasive editing. This audiovisual mechanism gave faces to characters, investigators, experts, neighbors, friends, transformed technical scenes into emotional tableau, and elevated visual details, a window, a map, a distance, to the status of icons. The public narrative thus emerged less from a formal process and more from a collective script, in which the editing decides what should be remembered and what could be forgotten. The impact of this exposure is ambivalent. On the useful side, massive visibility keeps the case alive when the normal news cycle would have already shelved it, pressures authorities to prioritize investigations, attracts resources, stimulates international cooperation, summons witnesses who only realize the relevance of a detail when they see it on TV, creates collaborative information bases, and, at times, restores coherence to scattered pieces that helps police test hypotheses. News and social media campaigns expand the reach of the alert, overcome language barriers, and allow information to travel quickly, something vital when the time window is narrow. The audiovisual archive, in turn, freezes versions and dates, allowing investigators to revisit apparent contradictions with public and recorded material. On the harmful side, however, the same exposure creates noise, simplifies uncertainties, and solidifies misunderstandings. By transforming evidence into dramatic twists, documentaries and reports foster unrealistic procedural expectations. The public begins to demand outcomes at a television pace, while real investigations require months of expertise, cooperation, and validation. The constant search for novelty shifts the focus from what is reproducible in the laboratory to what generates clicks. Rumors take on the appearance of hypotheses. Hypotheses take on the appearance of facts, and debate polarizes around emotional interpretations of interviews and gestures. Public opinion, fueled by frameworks that emphasize facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language, often confuses suffering with guilt or coldness with calculation, ignoring the effect of shock on memory and behavior. Furthermore, excessive spotlight taints testimonies. Versions begin to reflect what was seen in the news, not what was remembered. And each news special casts a shadow over endeavors that, by method, should remain discreet until they are ripe. There's also an agenda-setting effect. When a documentary becomes the theory of the moment, the press expands, the networks simplify, and the wheel turns, attracting resources to a specific line and draining energy from others equally plausible. The court of public opinion rewards certainties. Serious investigation operates with doubts. Amidst this, families and investigators learn to communicate in two languages, that of evidence, slow and arid, and that of broadcast, fast and emotional. When they manage to align the two, exposure helps. When they misalign, the media creates waves that forensic experts must then spend precious time undoing. The role of the media, therefore, is both strength and weakness. It illuminates paths, and at the same time casts shadows. Between a microphone and a report, the best protection of truth is the discipline of distinguishing spectacle from evidence, and maintaining, despite the noise, a tuned ear for what the chronology and method truly support. When we reach the point where chronologies are mapped, perimeters traced, and hypotheses put on the table, what's missing from the truth reveals itself less as a single missing object, and more as a set of critical gaps that prevent a definitive fit. The first of these is material, missing pieces of evidence that could tie scene, time, and agent together. Highly specific traces are missing, an unequivocal genetic profile with an impeccable chain of custody, a textile find that matches reference clothing or blankets, biological residue preserved in a condition that resists dispute, microfibers that consistently recur at different points in the case diagram. Even minor artifacts would be of enormous value, a discarded electronic component, SIM card, memory card, whose technical history reveals its trajectory. A vehicle fragment, lining, carpet, staple, carrying dust and fibers consistent with the environment of the disappearance. A mark on the ground preserved enough to allow inferences of weight, direction, and time. It's not that nothing was searched for, is that without these highly reliable pieces, the body of evidence remains light, vulnerable to the wind of reasonable doubt. The second gap is human. Key testimonies that do not yet exist, have not been identified, were not provided in sufficient detail, or have been contaminated by the passing of time. The case ideally requires eyes that saw something before knowing it mattered. A vehicle stopped where it usually does not. A person repeating routes at the same time. A light on out of context. A stray conversation recorded by a neighbor's distracted ear. Quality testimonies, in these circumstances, have specific attributes. They arise from direct perception, are temporally situable, and do not depend on reconstructions influenced by documentaries, headlines, or forums. There is also a need for technical re-interviews, conducted with memory protocols that minimize induction and consolidate convergences. Small variations in language matter less than structural consistencies of place, time, and action. At the same time, there remains a desire for voices that never spoke. People who circulated in the mid-height of the resort, suppliers, temporary workers, occasional residents, and who, because they did not belong to the most visible circle, escaped the initial radar. The third front is topographical investigative, where answers are still being sought. Areas still cry out for more detailed analysis. Stretches of terrain with confusing stratigraphy, altered ditches and slopes, dense vegetation where ground-based radar delivers ambiguous signals, poorly documented drainage points and service corridors. There are locations associated with likely routes that deserve resurfacing with improved technologies. High-resolution photogrammetry, LiDAR to map microdepressions under vegetation cover, soil spectrometry to identify chemical signatures consistent with specific materials. And there are negative spaces to consolidate, not only where something might be, but where it's proven that nothing was. A cartography of absence that, paradoxically, narrows hypotheses and saves steps. On the digital level, there are still traces to be exhausted, antenna correlations with renewed granularity, reconstruction of phone books of third parties who orbited the area, analysis of movement patterns extracted from historical data, cards, tolls, fueling, that, when cross-referenced, may reveal previously unseen synchronicities. Beyond that, procedural bridges remain. Cooperation between jurisdictions must transform requests into evidence that survives court scrutiny. What has been collected requires redundant documentation, preservation, and reproducibility. What is ultimately lacking is density, for clues to swell with material until they become evidentiary evidence, for scattered memories to gain external anchoring, for maps to cease being hypothetical and begin to display fixed points. As long as these gaps persist, the truth will remain at a distance measured not in meters but in precision, the amount of method necessary so that, when a piece finally emerges, it is not just another possible story, but the piece that finally makes all the others stop wavering. There's a silent measurement that runs through all these years. What fit into a childhood photograph today would be 22 years old. A face that time invented without witnesses. It's in this arithmetic that the family lives, not counting days backward, but imagining the ones that remain. They speak soberly, almost always choosing words that don't hurt. Hope isn't a cry, it's a thread that won't break. On birthdays, memories are lit like a porch light, so that if there's a return, there's a house lit up. The portrait of the girl remains at the center, not out of denial of time, but out of love. It's the fixed point on a map that real life insisted on tearing apart. Between official announcements and the unstoppable routine, the parents repeat a simple refrain: keeping searching is the way they've found to keep living. There's a human dimension that no report captures. The school that never happened. The summers unlived. The stack of notebooks that never got written. The case, which became a debate and a dossier, is above all an absence that weighs heavily on the breakfast table. Therefore, each public update carries two layers: the fact and the wound. When they ask for discretion, it's not to hide. It's to preserve what little still belongs to them alone. When they agree to speak, it's not to fuel theories. It's to remember that, behind the timelines and the expert reports, there's a family that wakes up every day with the same question. Hope here isn't naivete. It's discipline. It marshals strength, sustains vigil, prevents silence from devouring everything. And even when the world is distracted, someone at home checks if the porch light is still on. If you know something, contact local authorities. Responsible information can be the bridge between what's missing and what's finally confirmed. And if this story touched you, leave a respectful comment. Words matter when someone crosses a desert like this. To follow real developments without noise, without sensationalism. Subscribe for updates. The truth needs time and unwavering attention. In the meantime, may the light remain on.